I always really like when people say you should get educated on the subject because it gives me the opportunity to dunk on you because you obviously aren't educated on the subject. Anyway, let's get to that thing where I dunk on you. This is a book called Madison's Hand. It's written by Professor Mary Sarah Bilder. She is a constitutional law professor and really the foremost expert on the 1787 Constitutional Convention. But let's dive into the Second Amendment because that's what you want to talk about. Why was the Second Amendment written the way it was? We're going to focus on two things. Necessary to the security of a free state versus free nation, and the role of a militia in 1787 and why we found it necessary. So why did we choose the word free state rather than free nation? Well, Madison's Hand is about James Madison, and he took contemporaneous notes during the 1787 convention, and he decided to write down what everybody was saying as they were making their arguments for what was necessary. And delegates from South Carolina and Virginia and a few others, mostly slave states, said that we needed to have a militia. Now, why did they say we needed it? Because they were worried about slave uprisings. There had been numerous slave uprisings around the United States, along with in the Caribbean. Notably, 2 years later, in 1789, Jamaica would have a slave uprising that ultimately allowed Jamaica to become a free black state. And so this was top of mind for most slave owners. Charles Pinckney from South Carolina, the youngest delegate at the convention, also probably the wealthiest, was the largest slave owner in the state of South Carolina. He argued on the floor of the 1787 convention that he needed to, quote, keep and bear arms because he needed to be able to maintain arms on his residence, at his home, on his plantation. Why? Because militias would typically have their arms in an armory. So even with militias, right, usually you wouldn't have all the guns, like at your house. You would have an army that you would go to that would arm and equip your militia. But the reason that he said keep and bear arms is because he was worried about slaves on his plantation. So the reason you're allowed to have a gun in your home is because people like Charles Pinckney and Patrick Henry argued, Patrick Henry from Virginia, who ultimately became the governor of Virginia, by the way, argued that they were scared of slave uprisings. So that's why they said they needed to have guns. And it was people like Governor Morris from Pennsylvania who said, fine, fuck it, right? Security of the free state, not security of a free nation, because Pennsylvania didn't have slaves. They'd already abolished slavery like Massachusetts and Maine. So that's the whole thing that you need to understand here. Remember, West Point wasn't founded until 1802, which is during Jefferson's presidency. Jefferson was notably absent from the 1787 convention. Now, when he got back and he was talking to James Madison, who had taken notes for him, he said, hey, why the fuck did we found a national army? And Madison was like, we were going to get to it later. And then they never did, which is why he created West Point in 1802. And even with West Point, we realized that militias were wholly under-equipped because in the War of 1812, the British absolutely fucking kicked our asses. Remember, they took Detroit and they burned down fucking Washington. That's when we realized militias were ill-equipped to defend our nation. So not only are you wrong on one point, you're wrong on both. You should get better educated on the subject so I don't have to dunk on you again.